Let's talk about Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. This is maybe, I think it says it's the only book that won the three big Sci-Fi awards, which I think it is saying are the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Arthur C. Clarke in 2014. And also won the Locus, which I would say is one of the big three, and the British Sci-Fi Association award. So basically the only massive award it couldn't win either World Fantasy, because it's not a fantasy book. The basic idea is that the main character is the last surviving biological drone of a big artificial intelligence that ran a ship and hundreds of drones as well. And everything else has been destroyed, and there's just this one drone left, who is our first-person character and point of view character, and who is attempting to... I think it does actually say... trying to deal with some treachery that destroyed her. So that's the kind of plot. And this is a quite good book. This is a good book. It is not a great book. So I should say one thing to start with is it ends really well after being pretty slow to start with. So it ended well. I really enjoyed it at the end. And I thought it concluded really strongly. But I think when you think this is one of the most successful books award-wise ever, and that means not just that, it impressed a panel or a group of voters at a convention or whatever, but that it really blew away a whole kind of generation, and literally in this sense a year, a whole group, kind of tranche of voters and conventions and panels. It's just decent. It's just pretty good. I bet if I'd read every sci-fi and fantasy book from 2014, I'd find several that were better, I think, in my view. And I think here's the thing, that this is a kind of Ian Banks-ish, culture-ish, hard sci-fi novel. Interesting big ideas, and it does a lot with them. And I'll kind of bring in some critique of technique and stuff there. It does a lot with them, and it ends up being able to pull off an interesting mystery. There's a degree of like detective mystery, or for you as the author, for you as a reader at least, sometimes for the characters as well. But it's not quite Arthur C. Clarkean in terms of static dryness in its writing, but it's only written respectably. The characters are probably more interesting to the author than to me. They grew on me a little bit. Some of them did a little bit, but it was kind of a tough journey in some ways. Sometimes left potentially intentionally confusing, and I can live with that actually. I thought there's some interesting hints of like what is going on with these characters, but I nonetheless sort of left feeling not particularly attached to any of the characters, just vaguely affectionate perhaps. And the big thing it's strong at, so the big things I'd say it's strong at in general, other than a very satisfying kind of like ending after a slow start to middle, the two things it's strongest at are the concept stuff, the big Banksian kind of world building and idea discussion, and I guess the other thing I'd say is it's very strong at completely gone from my mind. It's the detective stuff. It is quite strong at kind of letting you discover the world, though that's part of the slowness. It starts slow there, and it gets more interesting in terms of its detective work. But even those things, the detective stuff is part of the pacing problem, and the concept stuff runs into technical issues. I'm going to try to explain this without spoiling too much, but say here two themes the Wikipedia entry mentions, and these are both big themes conceptually, not thematically necessarily, but conceptually, like plot-wise, it's not important plot-wise, are artificial consciousness, somewhat important plot-wise, and gender blindness, not particularly important plot-wise. I'd say also the idea of identity and differentiation, and the way in which we understand ourselves and the world around us, which connects to the artificial consciousness thing. Really interesting book in lots of ways, and so all power to it for discussing those issues. And I'd say also it deals with imperialism and cultural assimilation and change. But there are some surprisingly naive or incomplete or just technically poor ways this happens, as well as the good ways. So the gender blind thing, very important, pervasive, ubiquitous, arguably an even more more obvious authorial intrusion in terms of you're being brought to look at, what you're focusing on, than the issue that you've got an AI's lone biological drone, which is a massive part of the plot as well as the concept, kind of conceptual elements. So you've got this thing where the gender when Breck, our character, is thinking in Radch, or Radch, the main language, the Imperial language, in the female pronoun, but that essentially functions as a gender neutral pronoun. Everyone is a she, and this enables the author to present a kind of eventually clearly utopian view of a gender blind world, and that is a point that she wants to make. And at points that's actually quite interesting. The idea is how far does language shape our worldview? But there's a lot of telling and not showing, and because it is pervasive and ubiquitous, but not plot central, it sometimes does jar because I want to spend time thinking about other stuff, but there's another way this is being brought up, or another way in which the literal language game is being played. Almost semi-technically language game is being played, and I think that's technically flawed. The discussion is interesting. I think the execution is often flawed. I think that it raises the issue of empire really interestingly, and at one point there's seemingly going to be a genuinely interesting discussion about it, which then kind of disappears. But the irony here is that she's anti-empire. Big news. An author nowadays is anti-empire, aren't we all? But that this utopian gender-blind language is propagated and spread, and the social attitudes connected with that propagated and spread by the Radch annexing and going out and taking over places. And that's good, is it? No, well, actually the annexation is bad, but the thing is good. But the thing is utopia. And this is something you think Ian M. Banks just ran straight into. Yeah, the culture does terrible things. It does profoundly evil things for the greater good. That was what he believed was good and true. And I don't think Leckie deals with that, personally. I should say, I'm not sure if her surname is pronounced that. It might be Leshy. But yeah, Leckie doesn't deal with that. That's just left out there. Maybe this is book one of a trilogy. Maybe it is dealt with. So yeah, I left happy because I'd enjoyed the end. I do not feel like it was a successful book on the scale of the awards. I think it was a successful book on the level of like a decent, clever potboiler. It's not Banks or Robinson in terms of other kind of genuinely quite high concept, more recent last 30 years kind of writers. Maybe I can believe that the other books are better. I think you can imagine if this is her first published novel, you can imagine them more technically adept. I'd recommend it if you find the themes and the plot I've spoken about interesting. I don't think it's a bad book. I think it's a good book, but I think there's a need to measure it. Make sure your expectations are right to know what kind of book this is. Anyway, that's what I think about it. If you have read this, tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me other good, like high, hard sci-fi, big concept sci-fi that you enjoy. Till next time.